So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final session of May I Ask a Question for 2019. If you didn't get it already, the pun is that it's May. It's May I Ask a Question. So, welcome to the party if you just realized that. I am streaming from the World Trade Center of New York this morning, out of the Cardstack offices, and I just want to give you all vertigo before we get started. It's pretty exciting. How are you doing, Chris?
Yeah, good. I'm feeling some minor upstage from your great backdrop, but I could always put New York buildings behind me and my green screens.
That's true. Or you could be in outer space.
I could be in outer space.
Why didn't we do that for the last one? That would have been good.
Maybe next year. Up the budget.
Yeah. So I do enjoy these live streams, and Chris and I have chatted about doing a couple more, just sort of like on a more casual, ongoing basis. So if you've watched these and found them helpful, or just, enjoyed the banter, we will be doing things similar throughout the year, just not every single week like we have for the month of May.
Yeah, so if you do want to follow along, you can follow JW, there we go, Jen Weber on Twitter, or myself, I'm real8, real_ATE, or of course, if you're currently watching this on Twitch, you can hit that follow button, and then you should get notified anytime we're doing another stream like this. I think that's about it. Do you want to get into today's question?
Yeah, so we're going to do a short session, ending in about half hour, 20 minutes maybe. And so we're just going to pick off one question here. And our question for today is lazy loading model data. And if you could just zoom in a little bit, absolutely. Actually, to make it a little easier for everyone to see. This user says that they are trying to render Ember model data, which has more than 1,000 records, and this takes more than 2 minutes to finish the rendering part for them. So they have a plan to optimize it. They want to load first 100 records, then render, and presumably then render those, and then once they go to the end, I need to load the second 100 records. So before we started the call, Chris and I were going back and forth about what we think this user actually, means that they want to do. Like if we were to describe this as a user story style problem, what is the experience that they're aiming to deliver? And so, Chris, if you want to pull up that infinite scrolling, for example, if you visit Twitter, if you visit Twitter and you scroll down to the bottom, you wait a moment and then the next set of tweets show up. So they could be talking about that when they say then when the user goes to the end, I want the next 100 records to show up. That's one thing they could be talking about. Another thing is that when I said, when they go to the end, I interpreted that as once 100 records load and render, then they want the next 100 records to load and render without, moving around the page, just like say you're doing a really intensive data visualization or something like that.
Yeah.
And now that I've read this again for the fourth time, I do think that when they say go to the end, they're likely describing this infinite scroll experience. But the other problem is definitely something I've run into while working on data visualizations. I was doing, it was more than 1,000 records. It was more like 10,000 records, trying to figure out how to load and render and process client side some data from those records. This was for some enterprise applications. So it's not your typical web app that I was working on. It was more like a desktop replacement that did scientific data analysis. So I was thinking why don't we start out with the infinite scroll thing, Chris? And like how you might approach that, just because I do think that's more likely. Once they go to the end, meaning the
Well,
user?
I think this is the kind of the point. You said it there earlier on when you were talking about this as like user stories. You know, this question is probably the best example that we've had on this season about it really mattering how you interpret the question, because you know this can be interpreted multiple different ways, and it's also an interesting question because it's already got an answer. So if you interpret this question in terms of, I only want to query the first 100 records, and then when I get to the end, it then does another network request to get the rest of them. Kind of like what we saw in Twitter. Like if we bring up the actual dev tools in a way that people can see on the screen, and we hit network, and then we run, I don't know if you're able to see that, limited to XHR, and then you go to the end of the page, you'll see it's doing another request to get more tweets. So that's one way to interpret this question, that it's actually doing like a network load, and that's the way that it's been answered. But it's interesting that the first thing that you're thinking about is this kind of infinite load question, which is also another very important idea, that you have like a very efficient way to render like, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of data entries on a single page. And again, very, very valid interpretation of this. I'm wondering if this is a kind of a much simpler question of just, you know, they've downloaded 1,000 records and they just, like if they, where's the thing here? It takes 2 minutes to finish the rendering part. Like, I don't exactly know what that means. Like, do they mean that it downloads really quickly, but then for some reason, because they've got really complicated components with like loads of DOM elements, that it locks up the rendering because it's putting too much DOM on the screen at once? Is that what they're talking about? Or do they actually mean rendering part is part of the download as well? What do you think?
That's a really good question. And actually, one thing that I think is a common mistake for front-end developers, like all of us kind of have to learn this lesson a couple of times, is like how to distinguish between problems with speed and performance due to API requests versus due to the app itself. So I'll give an example. I inherited a 113 app in my first job as a developer, and as I was working on this app, it got slower and slower and slower and slower as I was adding routes, until it was taking like 3 seconds to load or something like that, maybe 4, and that just really obviously was not acceptable. And I was thinking, like, what am I doing wrong? Like, I know that Ember is supposed to be fast. I know that nothing about Ember blocks you from writing code that would make it slow. You have the power to do whatever you're wanting to do. And so I was thinking, like, I've got to be doing something wrong here in my code base. Like, maybe I have too many dependencies. I was like, thinking all these things, and everyone's like, yeah, gee, Jen, this app, like Ember app's really slow. I don't know, maybe we should be looking into like a different framework for this. What had happened was that I didn't know this, like I never looked at it, but the user record was getting overloaded with tons of metadata. And so what was happening is that anytime you requested the user object, it was coming back with all the included data. And when I first started the project, it didn't matter because there was basically no data there. It was like a prototype at that point that I started working on it. And so it got slower and slower and slower because the payload and the search on the server side to compose all of those relationships was very slow. No one had optimized that. And it wasn't that my Ember app took 4 seconds to load. It was that my Ember app was asking for the data. 4 seconds would go by, the data would come back, and it would just render in a flash. And so I think there's also a question here of like, you know, what does it, how could it, is the problem actually rendering? You know, if I wouldn't, it's a little bit outside the scope of this Stack Overflow question, but it is something that I would think of immediately if a coworker came to me and said, I don't know why. You're like, how do I make this stuff render faster? I would inspect the network to see if that's actually the problem.
Well, this is, I think, the kind of key to any type of programming, especially web programming, because there's so many pieces that are talking to each other. You really have to check. You have to see where the slowdown is. And I don't know if many people have actually used this performance tab on Chrome DevTools, but it's really quite useful to figure out where there might be some performance bottlenecks, whether it's your code or whether it's like network. And again, I'm using your Twitter as a example here, but there's this thing on the performance tab. You can click Start Profiling and Reload Page, and it'll go and refresh the page for you, but it'll also, if everything works nice and perfectly, it'll give you all this funky stuff here. So the thing that's most interesting from my perspective is the fact that it actually gives you like a screenshot of what the page looks like.
Did
at
it
any one
always
page.
do that?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely.
Oh.
I think you
Interesting.
used to have to
Alright.
tell it to. There used to be, like,
okay. I
one
was
of
going
these
to say, I
things.
don't think I've seen that myself.
Oh, there it is.
actually.
There it is. Capture screenshots. So, like, the idea is that you have to, once you have screenshots clicked, you can see where the slowdown is. And, like, maybe this isn't the best example because, like, Twitter have been spending millions and millions on actually, like, speeding stuff up. But,
Oh yeah.
like, if we go to any of your own websites, like, let's get ourselves another scapegoat here. Emberjs.com. Oh God. I hope this is better than. So if we do the same thing.
Yeah. Have you profiled this
Oh,
recently?
I haven't.
Should be good.
It should be fine.
Should be better than it was in the past.
And then, so interestingly, I don't know why they do this, but it starts off with the previous page load, essentially. So it starts off with a render. I don't know how to stop it from doing that. But as you can see here, actually, the entire thing has, like, it's really fast, actually. But one of the things that you can also do is you can tell it to go into, like, slow 3G and slow CPU, essentially, and do the same thing.
Yep, that's pretty cool.
Which allows you to kind of see your app, how your users might actually see it. And, like, I could spend 40 hours going into details here, and not, just for the record, not because I'm an expert, it's just I've watched one or two videos or talks of people going through all this sort of stuff. But essentially, like, each one of these colors, these, like, purple, this, like, yellow stuff up here, whatever, all mean different things. Like, some of it is, like, rendering, there we go, scripting. So there's a lot of JavaScript happening. And the reason it's taking so long is because we've slowed down the CPU to be much slower, like a low-end phone or something like this. So, you know, to wrap this back around to the original Stack Overflow question, like, when they say 2 minutes to finish the rendering part, does that mean 2 minutes before anything shows up on the screen? Does it mean 2 minutes until, like, if you click the network thing, again, this is all, I'm not an expert in this, but it's something that you can play around with. Until, like, each one of the, like, data pieces are down. You know what I mean? It could be that, as you said with your example, the back end is taking ages to load all of the data. Like, 1,000 records. I don't know how big that is. You know, it could be megabytes depending on your use case. But again, you know, it doesn't necessarily answer this particular question. We have to kind of decide which question we actually want to answer. And this user down here, I don't know how to, Mr. Henry. Actually, I think they've popped up in previous May I Ask a Questions. But Mr. Henry actually looked at this from the network perspective. Like, how do we paginate the requests to the backend?
Right.
And what I was thinking, like, I know we don't have much time today, but if this is really a rendering thing, we could show a quick example of the like paginating, but in the front end, assuming that the downloads come back quickly. We could just show a bit of a pagination in the front end.
Kind of like filtering. There's also a bunch of add-ons
Yes, that's good.
that help with this sort of thing. There's I don't know, is it called Ember Infinite Scroll, something like that. I've looked at this. There's also an infinitely scrolling table that multiple people have made different iterations of, because, you know, each, depending on what the use cases are, you know, there's no one size fits all kind of thing when it comes to infinite scroll. In the same way, I don't think there's any one size fits all when it comes to, you know, like how to set up your API in your database, right? Like there's you can follow certain patterns, you can choose to follow certain standards, but there's no like one perfect answer. And I think that's the same way for Ember add-ons that people have made, as well as general JavaScript.
Yeah, and this is
things. Yeah, so
that's a very good point as well. You know, this isn't a problem that's specific to Ember. Ember tends to do a lot of the app for you, but knowing where your slowdowns are is just general web development. And I guess maybe in some cases Ember, if you're kind of just using it out of the box and you're not very familiar with it yet, it might be hard to kind of know where each of those slowdowns actually are. But I think with a little bit of time in this and kind of learning the DevTools performance profiler, you can really start seeing it where it's like, you know, actually, do you know what? The data came down really quickly, and I can see that in the network tab, but for some reason it's taking a long time to render, and that might not even be JavaScript, that might not be Ember's fault, that might be the fact that you just got like a ton of DOM elements, and, you know, you need to reduce the amount of DOM that you're trying to render. So
that's true.
We have some people. Mel Sumner in the chat is bringing up a very important point. Please think about accessibility when considering the use of infinite scroll.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, this is definitely a big challenge.
I think that would be an interesting thing for someone to dive into, is do the existing Ember add-ons implement anything for accessibility with infinite scroll? So like, actually I don't have that chat pulled up, but from what I know about accessibility, is one of the main challenges with single page applications is that stuff on the page re-renders. You know, that I as a user am going to see that change with my eyeballs, but the screen reader and other assistive technology that people may use to browse the web, it relies on sort of being alerted of events. And so if the changes that you're making don't say, hey, what's up, screen reader or other tool, I just changed something on this page, here it is, like, read this, then that means that the person who's using those tools is not going to be able to look at that content that has loaded, and like use it, navigate it, you know, enter information, none of that, because their tool that they're working with doesn't know about it. So one of if fixing that within an add-on is kind of like the superpower of the Ember ecosystem, I think, which is that, as we encounter difficult problems, we can build them into things that everybody can use. And so that way, we can solve it in a small number of places, and a bunch of people would just kind of get that, update like for free, right? Like in the perfect world, they don't even have to think about it beyond thinking like, I should check make sure that this works. They may not have to think about how to actually implement the eventing that comes with Infinite Scroll, because they can just use the add-on. You get to build up to this point where you don't need to know anything, and it just works.
Well, yeah.
What were you saying?
So yeah, there's an alternative approach as well, which is the thing that I was discussing. And looking at the time, I don't think we have enough time to kind of go into actually the
I don't
example.
think so either.
But if you actually look at the guides, the Ember guides, you'll see in the routing section they talk about query parameters. And this is something that you might want to consider if you're using pagination, where your application actually uses query parameters to kind of say what page it's on, or starting at a particular number and kind of moving on from there. So I don't know if we've got one here. Page, perfect.
Does that actually help though? Because I think you have to take a couple more steps in order for Ember to, I guess it helps, but Ember out of the box right now, I think as it changes routes, it doesn't necessarily announce the change, correct?
Exactly, and this is why I was going to bring up something that Mel Sumner has been working on. Accessibility Announcer, I think it's called. Ember Accessibility. I can't remember exactly what it's called. I think. No. I'll find the link and tweet about it after this, and if Mel's on the channel, she'll be able to point me towards it. But the idea is that Mel has been doing an awful lot of great work recently to get Ember's accessibility routing, accessible routing, actually part of the core framework, so that theoretically, when you start a new Ember app, it will announce when you're navigating to different routes correctly. Let's see if I can find it. Ember X. I know I've worked with. There we go. Oh, that's a different one. Mel Sumner. I can't remember exactly where it is, but I'll tweet about it.
Yeah, and in general, there is an accessibility. It's here. It's under the Ally org. It's A11Y Announcer.
Oh no! So that was one of them. There's a different one which is kind of more bare bones.
So in general, if you have accessibility questions, you can visit. There's an accessibility channel on the Ember community Discord, and that's a great place to learn and get some Q&A.
So this is the one here.
It?
Yeah, so it's called Ember
Ally
Refocus. So the point of this one is kind of slightly different than the other one, which kind of makes use of ARIA properties or attributes. This one essentially uses focus the way that it is. So it says here actually it's very similar to the Ally Announcer, but doesn't use ARIA Live essentially. Cool. Yeah, essentially the whole point of this is that theoretically, hopefully, if Mel's successful and kind of able to push this into the core framework, then we won't need to install this as an add-on eventually.
Cool.
So,
I would like that.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got to wrap up.
Absolutely.
Gonna quit here right at the top of the hour. In conclusion, we'll take a look at answering this question like typing after today's live stream, and I'd like to thank everyone for watching, and for all of our friends who have tuned in to give us some tips while we're talking and make the stream even better, as well as just to show their support for this kind of work. I think last year when we started doing this, there was sort of like a wasteland of unanswered questions on Stack Overflow, and like a ton of people have also stepped up to help answer those questions. So if you've ever, given out upvotes or answered some questions on Stack Overflow or Ember Discord or the Discuss channel, that's really important work. And I know I always appreciate it when I have the opportunity to ask other people for help. So thank you so much for that. And Chris, anything you want to add before we quit?
No, just thank you for doing this with me. It's always a lot of fun when we get on the stream, and I look forward to every week, and I'm a little bit sad that it's over for another year, but as you said, we'll be doing some other streaming stuff between now and next May. So
cool. Sounds good.
Follow along if anybody's interested, and thank you all for watching. Bye everyone.